I'm always working on a memoir called The Accidental Terrorist. I think it's actually done right now. But the piece I'm going to read, which is going to be a little long, is adapted from a chapter of that. The memoir is about 6 months of my life when I was a Mormon missionary for the LDS Church. This is a bit of a flashback chapter, changed up a little bit to work as a standalone piece. This is called The Fanatic in the Street. Temple Square occupies a full city block in the heart of Salt Lake City. Most of its several buildings, including the famous ovoid tabernacle, stand open to the general public. Walled off from approach by all but card-carrying faithful, however, stands the grand and towering temple itself. Built from gray Utah granite dragged by ox team from distant mountain quarries, the Gothic-style temple was begun in 1853 and took 40 years to complete. A marvel of frontier architecture, its clean lines, narrow windows, and 6 elegant spires draw the eye inexorably toward the heavens, inspiring thoughts of eternity even in non-believers. Each spire rises more than 100 feet, the tallest topped by a gilded statue of the angel Moroni, the being who gave Joseph Smith the golden plates, source of the Book of Mormon. Latter-day Saints shun iconography in their churches, but that didn't always hold true, as any cursory inspection of the temple will show. Adorning the outer walls, you'll find such symbols as clasped hands, the all-seeing eye, and the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. These are some of the few remaining relics of the folk magic traditions from which Mormonism arose, and their presence on the temple can be startling even to believers. But if you find the outside strange, just follow me inside. Not time to turn the page yet. I first entered the Salt Lake Temple on August 15th, 1986, in the company of my parents. I had turned 19 the day before and was scant weeks from a 2-year missionary posting to Canada. I was dizzy with hunger, having fasted since breakfast the day before, but that was nothing compared with my excitement and dread at the prospect of initiation into the deepest mysteries of my faith. That day I was to experience the most sacred and mysterious of all LDS rituals, endowment. Temples are houses of advanced worship, not for ordinary Sunday services. Admission is by recommend, a card bearing one's name and the signatures of his bishop and stake president. To acquire it, I'd been interviewed separately by both men to ascertain my readiness and worthiness for endowment. They placed particular emphasis on the question of whether I had sympathy for any apostate or heretical individuals or groups. My answer was a resounding no. I didn't even know any apostates. And besides, how could I have sympathy for anyone foolish and sinful enough to rebel against the restored gospel? The closest I'd physically been to an apostate was once or twice a year when a wild-eyed, bearded fanatic would stand in the street outside my high school and hand pamphlets to the students. The pamphlets purported to expose what really went on in the Mormon temple, but I always junked them without a glance at their contents. My teachers assured me the pamphlets were filled with lies, and why expose myself to that? I would experience the endowment for myself soon enough, and then I'd know the truth. The temple interior was furnished in varying shades of off-white. Sleepy senior citizens dressed head to toe in white sat or stood or milled about on every side. Guides, guards, receptionists, priests, and patrons alike. A reverent and preternatural hush held sway, as if the very air deadened sound. The hallways smelled of Scotchgard and refrigerants. My first hour there was a whirlwind of activity. In various quick rituals, I was washed clean from the blood and sins of my generation, anointed a king and priest to the Most High God, blessed with a new name, Noah, same as every other first-time male that day, I later learned, and dressed in the garment of the holy priesthood. This last item was essentially a white cotton piece of underwear. As a reminder of the covenants I was about to make, I was told to wear it next to my skin for the rest of my life. As I donned white clothing in a changing stall deep in the bowels of the temple, I had a moment to examine the garment. It came in two pieces, a top like a scoop-neck t-shirt, and a bottom like knee-length boxer briefs. What intrigued me, though, were the symbols stitched into the clean white fabric, an L shape at one breast, a V at the other. I had occasionally glimpsed these same marks on my parents' garments while helping sort the laundry. I looked forward to finding out what they meant, even as I thanked God I hadn't lived 100 years earlier, when the garment extended to the wrists and ankles. I grew up in Kaysville, Utah, a burgeoning town nestled between the Great Salt Lake and the Wasatch Mountains, 10 miles south of Ogden. On our family excursions, we would often drive past a mysterious white building in the Ogden foothills that looked like a collision between a classical Roman temple and a wrought iron foundry. Most intriguing of all was the capital G surmounting the building's portico. Two overlapping V's enclosed the G, top and bottom. What does that stand for? The 7-year-old me wondered. God? Ghosts? Go away? One clear Saturday morning, my curiosity overpowered my imagination. "Hey, Dad," I asked as we passed, "what's that building?" My father, behind the wheel, glanced at the glowering structure, and a storm cloud seemed to gather inside the old station wagon. My sisters and I tensed in the back seat, something in my father's demeanor making us anticipate an answer we weren't sure we wanted to hear. "That's the Church of the Devil," he said grimly. I never doubted the literal truth of my father's words, not until I was much older. Not, in fact, until after I had been endowed in Salt Lake City. Not until after I discovered that the dread edifice of my nightmares was actually Ogden's Masonic Temple. Not until I discovered that men like Mozart and Haydn, Voltaire and Goethe, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson had all belonged to that selfsame fraternity, as had Joseph Smith, Mormonism's beloved founding prophet. By 1842, Joseph's young church was well established. His followers numbered around 20,000, half of whom lived in the prosperous city of Nauvoo, Illinois, where he was mayor. On March 15th of that year, the 36-year-old prophet received his initiation as an entered apprentice mason. The next day, he advanced to the fellow craft and master mason degrees. On May 4th, a scant 7 weeks later, Joseph introduced a new Mormon ordinance, the endowment, to his trusted inner circle. This ceremony bore a striking similarity to Masonic initiation rites, a parallel which could not have been lost on Joseph's associates, since most of them were recently inducted Masons too. In 1986, I participated in a ceremony directly descended from that one, though you'd be hard-pressed to get Latter-day Saints like my parents to admit the Masonic connection. My father and I joined my mother upstairs in a chapel where a woman played hymns on a muted electric organ. Except for receiving new names, my parents had not undergone the same initiatory rites I had. They had both received their own endowments many years before that day, and that day would stand as proxies for dead people whose names had been unearthed in the church's never-ending exhumation of genealogical records. Other saints had earlier stood proxy for these dead in washing and anointing rites. Now my parents would be their proxies in the endowment, giving them the chance to make it to the highest level of heaven. Other patrons drifted reverently into the chapel and sat down to wait. When about 80 to 100 had assembled, an elderly gentleman summoned us all to the creation room. At the pace of cold molasses, we filed into a large room painted on walls and ceilings with murals of rocky land, heaving oceans, and clouded skies. The carpet underfoot shimmered a pale blue, matching the upholstery on the rows and rows of theater seats that filled the space. We men filled the seats to right of the center aisle, and the women took seats to the left. A sour-looking man with steel wool hair addressed the men's side in the room. Brethren, you have been washed and pronounced clean, or that through your faithfulness you may become clean from the blood and sins of this generation. You have been anointed to become hereafter kings and priests unto the Most High God, to rule and reign in the house of Israel forever. He turned to the women. Sisters, you have been washed and anointed to become queens and priestesses to your husbands. His eyes narrowed as he scanned us all. If you proceed and receive your full endowment, you will be required to take upon yourselves sacred obligations, the violation of which will bring upon you the judgment of God, for God will not be mocked. If any of you desire to withdraw rather than accept these obligations of your own free will and choice, you may now make it known by raising your hand. I felt the cold touch of a ghost on the back of my neck. What was I getting myself into? The sour man scanned the room. I glanced around covertly and saw that no one else seemed greatly distressed. In fact, most folks looked downright bored. My father patted me reassuringly on the knee, and with reluctance, I swallowed my misgivings. The lights in the creation room dimmed, and what can only be described as a mystery play began. We were first treated to a crashingly dull radio drama recounting the first 5 days of creation, emanating from an overhead speaker, during which time slowed to a crawl, and many of the older patrons in the gathering fell asleep. At length, the actors emerged from behind a curtain, dressed in no costumes but their white suits and ties, and enacted the sixth day, the creation of man. God the Father, or Elohim as he is known in LDS theology, breathed life into Adam, then put him to sleep again to take the rib from which he created Eve. As Elohim awakened Adam from this sleep, we men in the audience were instructed to rise and open our closed eyes. At the close of this episode, the entire audience shuffled from the creation room into the garden room, which boasted a more lively green color scheme and murals of lush pastoral murals. The familiar story of the Garden of Eden continued, with Elohim instructing Adam and Eve not to eat of the fruit of the tree of good, it's a long name. The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and Lucifer, a hammy old man in a blue suit and a red-trimmed black apron, arriving to tempt Eve into transgression. When Adam partook of the fruit as well, the approaching voices of Elohim and Jehovah, God the Son, became audible. "See, you are naked," said the leering Lucifer. "Take some fig leaves and make you aprons. Father will see your nakedness. Quick, hide!" "Come, let us hide," said Adam to Eve. The officiator of the endowment stepped forward. "Brethren and sisters, put on your aprons." We had each carried with us a bundle, a foot-square fabric pouch containing robes and other paraphernalia, folded as densely as a parachute. The staged action ceased while everyone rummaged in his bundle. I found a green satin apron inside, embroidered with a pattern of leaves. My father helped me tie it around my waist with an overhand knot. When we all had our aprons on, Elohim and Jehovah arrived to confront Adam and Eve about the source of their stylish new figwear, then banished Lucifer from the Garden of Eden for crimes against haute couture. Elohim next administered an oath called the Law of Obedience to first the women, then the men. When this was done, the full audience rose together to receive the Law of Sacrifice, in which we swore to consecrate all we had to sustaining and defending the kingdom of God, including our lives, if necessary. "That will do," said Elohim, and we sat. "We will now give unto you the first token of the Aaronic priesthood, with its accompanying name, sign, and penalty." Penalty, I thought. What is this, a hockey game? Before doing so, however, we desire to impress upon your minds the sacred character of the first token of the Aaronic priesthood, as well as that of all the other tokens of the holy priesthood which you will receive in the temple this day. They are most sacred and are guarded by solemn covenants and obligations of secrecy to the effect that under no condition, even at the peril of your life, will you ever divulge them, except at a certain place that will be shown you hereafter. The representation of the execution of the penalties indicates different ways in which life may be taken. My mouth went dry. Okay, I thought, this is the part where they really should give you the option of bowing out. This is the part where there really should be a potion labeled "Drink Me" that will shrink you to the size of a cockroach or a fairy, so you can scuttle under the door to safety. But my father sat calmly beside me without a care in the world, and what could I do but trust him and the faith he'd passed on to me? If I was skittish, it was only because my faith was still immature. I did not yet enjoy the benefit of years of temple attendance, opening my eyes and sharpening my understanding. The first token of the Aaronic priesthood is given by clasping the right hands and placing the joint of the thumb directly over the first knuckle of the hand, in this manner. Elohim grasped the hand of a witness from the first row of seats, raising the grip high so we all could see. We give unto you the first token of the Aaronic priesthood. We desire all to receive it. All arise. We stood, and Elohim, Jehovah, and the other actors circulated through the audience, reaching across seats, to be sure every one of us had received the sacred clasp. As I grasped Elohim's dry, solid hand, I thought to myself, it's a secret handshake. I've just learned a secret handshake. No doubt I'd get a decoder ring, too, before the day was over. We took our seats, and Elohim said, "The name of this token is the new name that you received in the temple today. The sign is made by bringing the right arm to the square, the palm of the hand to the front, the fingers close together, and the thumb extended." As Elohim spoke, the officiator demonstrated beside the altar. This is the sign. The execution of the penalty is represented by placing the thumb under the left ear, the palm of the hand down, and by drawing the thumb quickly across the throat to the right ear and dropping the hand to the side. And in the manner explained, the officiator at the altar pantomimed slitting his own throat. "All arise," said Elohim. We arose. Vengeful butterflies fought a pitched battle in my stomach. Each of you make the sign of the first token of the Aaronic priesthood. This is the sign. Now repeat in your mind after me the words of the covenant, at the same time representing the execution of the penalty. I, think of the new name, covenant that I will never reveal the first token of the Aaronic priesthood with its accompanying name, sign, and penalty. Rather than do so, I would suffer my life to be taken. I thought the words in my mind, at the same time drawing a shaky thumb across my throat. I could picture the flesh parting like paper. Imagine the sting and slow shock as blood cascaded from that lipless grin to stain my white clothes crimson. "That will do," said Elohim. We sat, a motley collection of bloodless specters. My pulse pounded in my ears. If the debut of The Matrix weren't still 13 years in the future, I might have reflected on the words Neo hears from Cypher after being wrenched into bitter reality from his world of virtual comfort and illusion. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I take the blue pill? Though I did my best to assimilate this strange new form of worship, it was too much to encompass at once. Historical perspective might have helped, but of course I didn't have it at the time. In 1827, 15 years before joining the Masons, Joseph Smith began work on the Book of Mormon in upstate New York. An intense anti-Masonic fervor gripped the region at the time. William Morgan, author of an expose on Freemasonry, had disappeared in 1826, never to be seen again. The 5 Masons tried for his kidnapping and presumed murder were either acquitted or handed absurdly light sentences. Rumors of conspiracy ran rampant. Hatred and suspicion ran high. For a time in 1828, it even seemed as if the Fuhrer might hurt the presidential campaign of Andrew Jackson, a high-ranking Mason. It's no surprise to find the prevailing tenor of the time surfacing in the Book of Mormon, with its vehement diatribes against secret combinations and their oaths of darkness and murder. The strain is so predominant, in fact, that newspapers reviewing the Book of Mormon on its initial publication in 1830 readily picked up on the subtext, one going so far as to label it Joe Smith's anti-Masonic Bible. What is surprising is that by 1842, 12 years later, Joseph could sense no apparent conflict between the supposed Word of God as set forth in the Book of Mormon and his own participation in Masonic rites. Or maybe it's not so surprising when you consider the resurgence in popularity Masonry enjoyed during the intervening years. Joseph's political aspirations were hardly modest. He would go on to run for president in 1844, the year of his death at the hands of an angry mob, and could only be helped by association with the Masons. And while none of this explains why Joseph developed the endowment ceremony, it does shed light on why I was learning Masonic handshakes and penalties in a sacred LDS temple. The drama continued to unfold before me, with several extra characters joining the mix, including the apostles Peter, James, and John, and a curiously Protestant minister who tries without success to convert Adam and Eve to the notion of a God without body, parts, or passions. In the process, we swore more oaths: the law of the gospel, the law of chastity, the law of consecration, learned more secret handshakes, and pantomimed the piercing of our hearts and the evisceration of our abdomens. The attendant feeling of sick horror began to recede in me, replaced by a calm that perhaps partook more of numbness than acceptance. Still, I told myself that God must be greatly pleased by my reverent obedience. Along the way, we clothed ourselves in a full regalia of robes and sashes, with pleated caps for the men and veils to cover the women's faces. We progressed from the garden room to the world room, a desolate desert-like chamber painted with examples of the brutality of nature, and from thence to the restful and gorgeous terrestrial room, an upstairs space appointed with elaborate arches and moldings, all done in a white so rich and pure that it hurt the eye. The most prominent feature of the terrestrial room was the veil, a wide, pale blue curtain that curved in a semicircle behind the white altar at the front of the room. Here we were taught the meaning of the marks stitched into our garments: a carpenter's square on the right breast representing exactness in keeping one's covenants, and a compass on the left to guide one on an undeviating course toward life eternal. At the veil, each of us in turn reached our arms through artfully placed slits and embraced a proxy for the Lord standing on the other side. The name of this embrace was given as the 5 points of fellowship, another blatant theft from Masonic practice. Here the Lord tested our knowledge of the handshakes and their names. If we passed, and everyone did, thanks to the prompters hovering near, we were admitted through the veil into the celestial room, a simulacrum of the highest kingdom of heaven. Very ornate and beautiful with its high molded ceiling, elaborate chandeliers, gold-veined mirrors, and handcrafted clawfoot furniture, the celestial room looked more like Louis XIV's idea of heaven than mine. It was quiet and very cold. I shivered, managing to convince myself that my goose flesh was a manifestation of the workings of the Spirit. My mother had passed through the veil first, and she was waiting for me on the other side. She gave me a brief hug and whispered, "It's wonderful, isn't it?" I didn't know how to express my lunatic mixture of elation and aversion, so I just nodded. My father joined us a few moments later. "I tell you," he said softly, patting me on the shoulder, "you learn something new every time." Do you have any questions? You can ask them now." I shook my head. He smiled. "It's a lot to take in." It sure was. We sat down. I had much to contemplate. There was the distressing fact that my parents had been participating in this ghoulish ritual at least once a month for most of their adult lives. There was my new conception of the celestial kingdom as a creepy cosmic clubhouse, where God knew you only by a secret handshake and might impose any sick hazing rite as proof of loyalty. And there were the terrors of hell, which was surely where heretical thoughts like mine would lead me. I couldn't sort it all out. I'd have to pay closer attention on my next visit. Latter-day Saints would like to believe that Joseph Smith received the endowment ceremony directly from God, but the many correspondences with Masonic practice suggest perhaps he didn't. Was denial of this connection why my father called Masonry the Church of the Devil? I believe so, just as I believe his comment and attitude dissuaded me from looking more deeply into Masonry until after I'd been to the temple and left home. My two younger brothers embarked on LDS missions in 1994 and 1996, respectively. They received the endowment before leaving, but I'm relieved that, thanks to revisions enacted in 1990, they were never compelled to pantomime violent mutilation the way I was. The penalties have been removed from the ceremony, not simply because they seem to have made so many younger saints so uncomfortable, but as part of a calculated campaign to obscure and erase all trace of the church's origins in frontier folk magic and its borrowings from Masonry. As understandable as this is, it strikes me as unfair in a way. My brothers and I were raised under the same roof, but it's like the two of them belong to a different church than the one I grew up in. If they break their oaths, they can expect little more than a slap on the wrist, maybe excommunication, but how bad is that? I'll deserve to have my throat cut. Remember that fanatic in the street outside my high school, passing out grainy pamphlets to willfully ignorant children? That's what my subsequent research has made me. It took me 9 long years from the time of that first endowment to work my way out of the church. But now I am that fanatic in the street, hoping against hope that my words will find their way to one heartsick 19-year-old boy trapped in the upper rooms of the Salt Lake Temple. A boy wishing he'd known what he was getting into before he started, wishing he'd been brave enough to take the blue pill. He won't hear these words, of course, but as a proxy, maybe you'll do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's Tuesday Funk for January 1st. Welcome to the new year. We'll be back on February 5th. Please meet us here and stick around and have a couple of beers. Thank you very much for coming.